Scientists have been warning us of rising sea levels for decades. And now, new information reveals that the so-called Doomsday Glacier could add 10 feet of water to coastal cities around the world. Welcome to Technality. I'm Alex Melky, and today we're looking at what kind of impact the rising sea levels will have on Earth. Before we get started, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode of Technality. The Doomsday Glacier has been all over news headlines recently. A chunk of ice the size of Florida that scientists say is melting a lot quicker than they first thought. And if this ice shelf disappears, water levels could rise as high as 10 feet. But what exactly does that mean? And what's the difference between a foot of water and 10? What about 100? Let's start with 1 foot. Sea levels rising just 12 inches doesn't sound like much, but it would have massive consequences felt differently around the world. Anyone living in cities built by the water would see an increase in high tides, harsh storms, and chronic flooding. This chronic flooding would damage these communities first. According to a study by Nature Climate Change, sea levels rising just 8 inches could cost $1 trillion in damages every year. Florida would need over 10,000 football fields worth of foot-high sand just to keep its beaches afloat. Meanwhile, cities from New Orleans to Gansu, China would be facing the biggest humanitarian crises in their history. Moving up to 6 feet of water now, and things go from bad to worse. The eastern seaboard of the United States begins evacuating as cities like New York and Miami see hundreds of thousands of people displaced. Following the devastating floodwaters of 2012's Superstorm Sandy, New York began working on a $1.45 billion mega project that just might save one of the greatest cities ever built from washing away forever. Named the Seawall, this series of 5-meter tall floodwalls will be linked together, spanning a massive 4 kilometers. As we've seen in Pakistan, the power of violent, unrelenting floodwaters can have an incredible impact on the very foundation cities were built on. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. If the Thwaites Glacier, aka the Doom Glacier, keeps melting, sea levels will rise 5 feet. Countries like Bangladesh would be on the brink of collapse, Japan would be devastated, and much of Vietnam would be washed away forever. Before we move forward, it's important to contextualize this data. In the 80s, former NASA climate scientist James Hansen claimed that New York would be underwater by the mid-2000s. In 2009, Al Gore predicted all polar ice caps could be gone by 2014. These are estimates, not a fixed path, so take them with a grain of salt. When sea levels rise to 10 feet, entire cities across the globe have been left behind. Millions of climate refugees from New York and California are making their way deeper within the continental United States. Southeast Asia is underwater. In coastal cities, the foundations of buildings begin corroding away after a year of being submerged below saltwater. If the Thwaites Glacier melts entirely, this is where we'll find ourselves. Food supply chains would be disrupted on a scale humanity hasn't seen in hundreds of years. Hygiene would drop to unhealthy levels as clean water becomes rationed, used exclusively for drinking. As emergency services become overwhelmed, forest fires will begin ravaging drier climates, unchecked, leaving the world in a cycle of destruction. There are nearly 200,000 glaciers in the world, and they're not getting any colder. So what happens when things get even worse? We've seen what the impact of the slow drip of climate change will be on our planet. But now let's look even further ahead, to the worst possible case scenario. If we break down where the world's freshwater is right now, nearly 70% of it is locked up in glaciers. So what happens when every glacier around the globe suddenly melts? The apocalypse. First, sea levels would rise over 200 feet. Coastal cities like New York, Shanghai, and London would drown in the first wave of rushing floodwaters, not unlike the horrific scenes shown in the movie The Day After Tomorrow. The majority of our planet's freshwater explodes into the ocean, destabilizing our currents and weather patterns. As warm waters cool, temperatures in Northern Europe would launch part of the continent into an ice age. We've seen how bad the impact of just 1 or even 6 feet of rising sea level can be. And all the glaciers melting would have catastrophic effects on the planet. This is something we most likely won't see in our lifetime, but that depends on the steps we take today. Let me know what you've been doing to cut down your carbon footprint in the comments below, and I'll see you in the future.